One.
Bonjour, alors bienvenue à ce panel. Je suis Jean-François Roussel. Je suis professeur de théologie à l'Institut d'études religieuses de l'Université de Montréal. Alors, je voudrais d'abord, je suis très heureux de vous rencontrer. Je voudrais d'abord reconnaître que je parle à partir du territoire autochtone non cédé des Basses-Laurentides, au nord de Montréal, un territoire historiquement habité par les Anishinabés et par les Kanien'kehá:ka, aujourd'hui les habitants de Kanesatake, les Kanesatake-Ronu. J'ai le plaisir d'être le modérateur de ce panel en plénière sur Decolonizing Urgency, un thème extrêmement pertinent alors que nous avons tous hâte de retourner à une certaine normalité, mais qu'est-ce que ça veut dire exactement? Et là, nos panélistes vont en faire une étude, une réflexion, nous guider dans une réflexion décoloniale à ce sujet. On a très peu de temps. Je vais présenter les quatre présentateurs. I will switch to English just for now. The first who will speak is Denise Nadeau. Denise is an affiliate assistant professor in the Religions and Cultures Department at Concordia University. In 2020, she has published a book, Unsettling Spirit, A Journey into Decolonization. And her research interests include decolonization of the body, the deconstruction of whiteness and colonialism and Christianity and indigenous water laws. Denise will introduce the panel, and she will, I could say, she will set the terms of this discussion. After that, Michel Andraos will speak. He is Dean of the Faculty of Theology at St. Paul University in Ottawa. His main areas of teaching and research include intercultural theology, theologies of interreligious dialogue, and religion and culture. His current research is focused and his engagement in the reconciliation of the churches with indigenous peoples and theological conversation with indigenous spiritualities, not only in Canada, but all over Americas. Valerie Michelson is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Sciences at Brock University, and her research is concerned with the social, cultural, and religious norms that rationalize or normalize harmful health behaviors or attitudes, and that lead to adverse health outcomes. She recently co-edited the volume Decolonizing Discipline, Children, Corporal Punishment, Christian Theologies, and Reconciliation in 2022. And Becca Whitla is a professor of pastoral studies at St. Andrew's College in Saskatoon. And her book, Liberation, Decoloniality, and Liturgical Practices, Flipping the Songbird, was released last November. And Becca is also a liturgist and a musician. Just before introducing Denise, I don't think it's necessary to recall you practical information about chatting. You're doing it very well. So I just recall you to mute your mic during the presentations. Denise, it's your turn.
Okay, merci, Jean-François. Thank you. I come to this panel from the unceded territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanic peoples, which is Vancouver Island, Victoria area, for those who are not sure where that is. I am of mixed European heritage from a family with a long history of colonial dispossession in Quebec, in that land known as Quebec, and specifically in Gaspé-Kéwagi, which is where my family have had 12 generations of presence. My interest in decolonization has been informed by the fact that I also have been trained in somatic psychotherapies, and this has led me to focus more on decolonization of the body in the last few years. One point I want to make is that we're not offering a definition of decolonization, not only because it's a Eurocentric habit to define and classify and objectify, but also because I think it'll take a few years to really, a few generations, excuse me, to unpack what that means. First, to our title, Decolonizing Urgency, which is really a double entendre. We can decolonize the concept of urgency. It is very much part of a Western concept of time. It has to be done now. Quoting Blackfoot, Leroy Little there, Indigenous notions of time are cyclical, emphasizing process as opposed to product. If decolonization involves building relationships, surely this will take time and generations. The white liberal desire to fix things immediately is coded into the word urgency. On the other hand, we're in a conjuncture where a climate crisis and the inequities of the pandemic have exposed the need to make radical changes as soon as possible. A talk last week at SFU by Jody Wilson-Rainbow was entitled, Moving Slow When Urgent Change is Needed, Why Governments Struggle to Effect True Reconciliation. She talked about the need to uproot colonialism and systemic racism now. So even if decolonization is going to take time, or shall we say process, I propose that what can be undone be done in a more spatially oriented as opposed to time-oriented way. In my own work on decolonization, I've chosen to look at the Western psyche body and how white supremacy is underpinned by the need for control, individual autonomy, and certainty, and how that lives in the body, mind, spirit in daily practice. Indigenous scholar, Kwandamuka First Nation, Eileen Morton Robinson, who's she's from Australia, settlers scholar Eva Mackey, and recently Black scholar Ronaldo Walcott, all root white supremacy in the institution of property and private property, which, to quote Mackey, gives people the illusion of security and safety. This extends to fantasies of mastery over nature and control over the past, present, and future of one's own body and property, quoting Mackey. If property and its wider context, capitalism, is the key to white possessiveness, which is Morton Robinson's term, I am curious about how this is experienced in the body. If Black and Indigenous bodies have been objectified as property, how is white supremacy lived in the settler body? I use the term disembodiment. This is a fundamental disconnection from relations, an inability to fully occupy the body, a sensory numbness created by either historical or recent experiences of trauma, a violent culture which we live in, and very much a world shaped by colonial Christianity and Western science, which has foregrounded the mind as a brain and a worldview that has split the body from the spirit. The result is no sense of an embodied connection to plants, animals, the spirit world, in fact, all beings, including humans, no sense of being placed in a space, land. So white supremacy lives in the body. The reality of our interconnectedness may be understood as a concept, but not as a lived experience for many. Now, I will caution that I'm not posing an essentialism that Indigenous bodies all experience embodied interconnectedness and white bodies are all disembodied. I'm not saying that, because there's been a systemic disembodiment of both Black, Indigenous, and people of color and white people, but different experiences of disembodiment. In the present context, the term white supremacy body has emerged, popularized by African-American somatic therapist Resmaa Menakem, where all bodies are measured structurally against white bodies. The example of humanists, everything else is deviance. So the white body is normal. Here's our word normal again. So race is invisible for the white body, but is an operative experience for Black, brown, and Indigenous bodies. So where does this fit into the study of religion? Our experience of the body is connected to ontologies and epistemologies, which have real impacts. Euro-Western science concept of the biological body is itself a useful construct for capitalism. The body is a distinct object with separate boundaries, separate from the land and water and the more than human world. And it's very much a concept of the 17th century. This then affects the Western understanding of the human person, autonomy, will, and spirit. The intellect, again, is primary, and the intellect is valued as a source of knowledge. This is the disconnected body. I love a quote from Ardith Wacom, who's an Inklakatan lawyer, and I'll just share this quote because it captures the psychological aspects of the white supremacy body. An Inklakata elder once told me that the problem with the newcomers was that they were famished. She explained that newcomers never stopped eating away at the waters, at the land, at the trees, at the fish. Newcomers would log, mine, build subdivisions and bridges and highways, and fish to the point of extinction, and still never feel full or satisfied. To never feel full or satisfied is rooted in an inability to complete, to receive, instead of a giving and receiving experience of the body. It's a grasping, unable to let the experience be fully received. I often use the example of drinking a glass of water, and I usually use that in a longer time frame. And just to be able to look at how we can grab a glass of water and gulp it down and move on, and we'll fail to even be grateful for the glass of water and to be aware of where that water comes, what water bodies that water comes from. This is the result of not being fully present in the body in the moment, something that many religious traditions extol as an end goal, to live and act out of presence. European greed and possessiveness is lived in the body and treats all other beings as objects to be manipulated, used, and destroyed. Water is a resource to be used, managed, controlled, not a relative or a spirit to whom we have obligations and responsibilities, and to which we must listen. Rights and responsibilities to community, ancestors, land, and waters grow out of a sense of being in place. Angel Kyoto Williams, who's the Black Zen teacher, reminds us that people cannot be responsible for what they cannot feel. And disembodiment is experienced in the inability to feel and to sense. The inequities of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter have brought to the forefront now the demand for abolitionism, a demand that for many includes not only defunding the police, but an end to property, having a new commons and an ethic of care. And in the somatic world, there's a term now, somatic abolitionism. So let's get back to urgency. What we may see pandemic and post-pandemic is what white comfort white comfort may trump the pain of bodies who have suffered the most from the inequities of our system, both locally and globally. And white comfort is defined by property and possessions, hence the fear of the land back movement. So when we talk about Indigenous ontologies in the academy and in religious studies, it's important to remember that these are not just ideas. As Métis lawyer Aimé Craft says, land back is an agreement to work together for mutual well-being of people's land and water, and not about protection of private property and individual interests. Indigenous legal orders are embodied, in place, practiced, and lived out. To quote Métis scholar Zoe Todd, these are legal orders through which Indigenous peoples throughout the world are fighting for self-determination and sovereignty, and decolonization of the body is one step on the road to adopting and affirming Indigenous legal orders. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Now I will introduce Michel. It's your turn.
Merci, Jean-François. Thank you. Perspective. Although my topic is on like a reading of the theological scene in relation to decolonial theology and the decolonization of the churches, it's really not a strictly speaking or only a theological topic. It's a topic about church and society and church and culture. and relates to much religion. I've never felt these strict boundaries between the two disciplines. I move back and forth according to the needs for doing my research and work. So I work and live in Ottawa. It's an Anishinaabe, Algonquin, and ceded territory at an institution founded by the Oblate of Mary Immaculate religious order, who played a significant role in spreading Christianity in Canada from the middle of the 19th century and onwards, and particularly among Indigenous communities in Western Canada and Northern Quebec. Out of that place, there is a sense of now in the post Truth and Reconciliation Commission and post a new narrative about relationship between churches and Indigenous peoples, state and Indigenous peoples in Canada, comes the urgency to think about decolonization. A new awareness of the, need to click on my timer to make sure I don't pass the 8-9 minute mark. A new awareness of the colonial relationships between the churches and Indigenous peoples has been unfolding over the past few decades. What have you done to the Indigenous peoples is a question that haunts the conscience of the churches today. This new awareness is compelling the mainline Christian churches to radically rethink the future of these relationships, not just in Canada, but this is a question at a global scale. In the case of the Roman Catholic Church, the context out of which I am doing this work, recent popes and church documents have very clearly acknowledged the mistakes of the past and present, and there are serious attempts in many instances and local churches and regions to create new alternatives. The most recent statements and teachings and synods like Amazonia, the Synod for Amazonia, or the encyclical Laudato Si, coming out of the church institutionally, are trying to come to grips with the implication of colonization and search for new paths in the relation with Indigenous peoples. The majority of Indigenous peoples around the world are Christian of one denomination or another. They have been for several centuries a main target of the evangelizing and civilizing mission of the Western Christian churches. While many Indigenous Christians have left the churches in recent decades and the Christian faith, many others continue to maintain these connections and sense of belonging. Many Indigenous Christians themselves are also rethinking their relationship with and within these churches and are looking for ways to transform the colonial Christian legacy and affirm their Indigenous Christian experiences. Several new expressions of decolonial Indigenous Christian theologies and experiences of church exist in many parts of the world. Indigenous Christian theological voices are demanding right relationships with the churches that honor their spiritual traditions and make room for these traditions within the churches. And this is what the Canadian churches, for example, committed to by supporting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which says very clearly the respect of the Indigenous spiritualities on their own terms. And there's a lot more to be said on this, but at least in theory, these commitments have been made public, and now look for ways to know what that means. So to respect these these Indigenous traditions, this is a huge challenge for the churches and for theology, because they were not built this way or wired for that. Church hierarchies in general have no idea how to deal with these new situations. Yet there is no return to the old normal. In the Christian context, in the Canadian context, many developments have taken place over the past few years. However, despite the many actions for reconciliation and healing, the colonial wound is still open and deep, and the impact of colonization continues to be painful and will take a long time to change and heal, if it ever does. Obviously, apologies are not enough. As I just mentioned, most mainline churches in Canada have made apologies on several occasions since the 1980s. Several sectors of the churches have contributed in the past years to raising the public awareness and generated a national momentum for initiating processes of social change in connection and in support of indigenous people's self-determination and indigenous movements in general. The recent actions in support of Bill C-15 by many ecumenical movements is one example, but there has been ecumenical movements in support of indigenous self-determination since the 1970s. However, what describes the situation in the churches today, I think, is that they are unsettled. The word unsettling has often been used over the past few years to describe the magnitude of these changes, of the changes required in the settler societies and people, including the churches. But I think the unsettling has only just begun, and we still have a long way to go. The long-term impact and outcome of this unsettlement are not clear yet. The veil of innocence and that masked the violent history of the country and the role of the churches and Christian theologies has fallen. It is in the context of this new understanding of the church's complicity in colonial history and colonization that we now need to rethink the future and relationship with indigenous peoples. Many non-indigenous Christians from different churches, church leaders, Christian activists, and theologians, and this panel is an example, have been deeply transformed and converted literally by this new awareness and are a driving force behind this new theological rethinking and decolonizing theology, as our publications and the titles that we shared with you demonstrate. In my opinion, this radical shift among many of us who have entered this dialogue and been transformed by it is an irreversible shift and transformation, and there is no return to the old normal. Theology in this sense, where we stand today is the theological understanding and analysis of these colonial relations are still inadequate. As far as I know, no scholarly consistent theological effort has been made yet in the mainline churches in Canada for analyzing an in-depth understanding of colonial theologies, the ongoing coloniality of theology, and the theological violence, past and present. A systemic scholarly understanding of the pervasive violence from theological and ecclesial perspectives is crucial for the churches to move forward on the new paths they desire to. There is no aspect of the ministry of the churches that was not implicated in the colonial enterprise. The pressing work, then, is not only to acknowledge the colonial past and the damage generated, but to also do, and more importantly, understand how concretely were theology and church structures and ecclesial ministries colonial in a specific context, and what would contextual decolonial theologies of church structures and ecclesial ministries look like for moving forward in new relationships. This, for me, is an urgent task for theology in Canada today, and in this too, there is no return to the old normal. As of what is happening, I mean, like schools like ours in Ottawa, and because of our legacy and tradition and connection, we are certainly taking these questions seriously and trying to move in new directions in terms of, as the title of my paper presented, the proposal was on how do we include in the theological curriculum new decolonial perspectives, and is this possible for theology functioning from within the colonial structures of the churches to actually contribute to decolonizations? These are open questions. The answer is unclear. However, we're trying to be open to move in new directions and develop new courses and think of a new way how to transform our curricula. Yet the road is certainly very long and unclear. However, we're moving on this path and there is no return to the old normal from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel. Merci. Now, Valerie, if you want to resent.
Thank you so much, Jean-François. I am honored to speak to you from Brock University, which is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I am a settler researcher, and my academic home is currently in the health sciences, where my research focuses on equity and the social and cultural dimensions of child health. It is from here then that I engaged with the theme of this year's CSSR conference, Why We Shouldn't Return to Normal, and with the theme of this panel, Decolonizing Urgency. The urgency of my talk relates to the increases in child violence during the pandemic. My focus is corporal punishment. This is a unique form of violence against children in Canada because along with being legally protected, it is also often socially normalized. I will argue that churches in Canada hold accountability for this normalization of violence because of how they have, over centuries, animated interpretations of sacred texts that are rooted in colonial patterns of power and control. I will conclude by arguing that decolonial thinking opens alternatives for thought and action that can provide guidance in disrupting the repetition of historic harms and strengthen our commitment to all children. Let's start with corporal punishment. In 62 countries around the world, including Sweden, Bulgaria, France, New Zealand, Mongolia, Scotland, and Japan, all forms of corporal punishment against children are banned by law. This is because hitting a child is violence. But here in Canada, adults who use corporal punishment against children are legally protected by Section 43 of Canada's Criminal Code. This is baffling. Canada's law contradicts all scientific evidence. In more than 100 studies, including by Gershoff, Durant, and many others, corporal punishment predicted solely negative outcomes, including mental health problems, substance use, suicide ideation, depression, and anxiety. All children are harmed by corporal punishment, but girls who experience it are at greater risk of experiencing domestic violence as adults. While it is common to hear adults normalize corporal punishment and say things like, I was spanked and I'm okay, the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that if you were spanked as a child, the odds were against you. Corporal punishment also violates children's most basic rights to physical security and dignity, rights that are protected in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So what does this have to do with COVID-19? COVID doesn't cause corporal punishment, or for that matter, any other form of violence. What it has done is to increase risk factors for children in terms of experiencing violence, and at the same time, make it much more difficult for children to access protective supports. Over the past year, physical distancing measures have been implemented to help reduce the spread of COVID-19. Repeatedly, we have been told, stay home. While home may be a safe haven for some, this instruction renders children who are already in risky or volatile situations increasingly vulnerable to violence in their homes. As Bradbury, Jones, and Isham note, these stay-at-home orders also render these same children much less able to access familiar support options, such as those found at school and through activities, friends, and extended family. This creates an urgent crisis-level situation in which children who were already at risk are even more vulnerable to the risk of violence in their own homes. Now I want to connect the dots between the urgency of heightened violence in the home and the urgency of decolonization. To make this connection, we look to colonial Christian theologies. In my research, I make a direct link between the normalization and justification of corporal punishment in Canada and colonial Christianity. Inspired by Christian interpretations of sacred texts, we often hear phrases like spare the rod, spoil the child, with the idea that it is a God-given responsibility for parents to use corporal punishment as a way of correcting a child's behavior, and that it is for their own good. I argue that the same social norms that normalize violence against children are often rooted in colonial patriarchal ideas of gender roles, power, and control, and that these social norms are often amplified through colonial Christian interpretations of sacred texts. While violent attempts to correct behaviors in a child harms all children across cultural pockets, one of the worst and most shameful examples in Canada occurred within the church and government-run residential schools. Here, a common theme of former students' experiences was the infliction of corporal punishment in response to their perceived misconduct, things like speaking their own languages and resisting sexual abuse. It is perhaps no surprise then that in 2015, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action, one of these, Call to Action 6, called upon the Government of Canada to remove Section 43 of Canada's Criminal Code, which I already told you is the law that protects adults who use corporal punishment against children. From 2017 to 2019, a bill to repeal Section 43, S206, was even sponsored by then Senator Murray Sinclair, who served as Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada between 2009 and 2015. Yet to this day, Bill S206 has not passed. This was just one of nearly 20 repeal bills to prohibit corporal punishment that have gone before the Canadian government since 1991. Internationally to date, 62 states, plus Scotland and Wales, have fully banned the corporal punishment of children, and 27 more states have clearly and publicly committed to doing so. Canada has done neither. And so Canadian children are in the position of being vulnerable to a form of violence in their own homes that is not only legally protected, but is often socially normalized as for their own good. Moving beyond COVID-19, we need a new and better normal, and decolonial thinking has much to contribute. In my recent book, Decolonizing Discipline, I and others use decolonial theological approaches to argue that there is nothing normal about hitting a child. In this volume, we urge all people who claim to follow the Christian faith in Canada to immediately stop normalizing, justifying, rationalizing, condoning, or turning a blind eye to violence against children, and to stop treating it as if it had any kind of legitimate place in the Christian faith, and to actively speak out in support of Call to Action 6 and the repeal of Section 43, because the blocking of that law being repealed is often coming from Christian communities. In our volume, we ask uncomfortable questions about the communal social norms that condone violence as any kind of acceptable way to resolve conflicts, regulate behaviors, and determine how individuals and groups should interact with and treat one another. And finally, we use decolonial theological approaches to interrogate how the very systems that have protected, ignored, or condoned violence in the past, such as were revealed through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and continue to be revealed to this day, still endure in Canadian churches in the present. Repealing Section 43 is both a highly symbolic and substantive piece of a coherent strategy that concretely addresses violence towards children and reconstructs society in the best interests of all children. The current pandemic is a defining moment, one that opens spaces for us to imagine a better world in which all children are legally protected from violence. Decolonial thinking has much to contribute by offering a protest against and a counter narrative to the colonial Christian narratives that have normalized violence against children for too long. There is nothing normal about hitting a child. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Now we pass to, we're going to our last presentation in this panel, Becca.
Thanks so much. I speak to you today from, I'm going to set my timer too, from Toronto, traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I also work in Saskatoon, Territory 6, Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. These two places are now home for many nations from across the Americas and around the world who have been invited to share land and life in the spirit of friendship, peace, and respect. Indeed, Abya-Yala, Atzlan, and Turtle Island have been places of great activity for thousands of years, where Indigenous peoples have been caretakers of these lands. But as we all know, the European conquering and settling of the Americas, which began 500 years ago, has been unleashing heinous physical, cultural, and epistemic violence upon people groups and the earth since then. Latin American decolonial thinkers call this all-encompassing residual web of colonizing processes, tendencies, and practices coloniality. It affects who we are, regulates how we understand the world, and conditions all our relations, and is built upon systems of white supremacy, capitalism, and Christianity, systems which have benefited people like me and our churches. My scholarship in practical theology, articulated in part in my book, grapples specifically with the ongoing impacts of coloniality in Christian worship practices, especially in singing. After more than 25 years of animating community singing in a variety of settings, I observed that when people gather to sing and worship, they bring their lived experiences with them, representing many cultures, languages, social and economic classes, etc. My response has been to draw on liberationist thinkers as a way to lift up the experience and the cultural traditions of the people as a place for doing theology and for transforming our world as part of a liberating praxis. In order to do that, I recognize that coloniality remains pervasively operative in our singing and our liturgies, as well as in life. There are three crucial dynamics that I identify and explore in my work that are part of the tension between coloniality and liberation in Christian worship practices, and I want to share with you today. First, the potential expression of complex cultural identities present in many communities is impeded by the dominance of the inherited canons of Western European, Anglo-North Atlantic hymnody and liturgical traditions. We need to therefore unmask the ways in which hymns preserve, reproduce, and reinscribe ideologies and theologies of empire in order to expose this coloniality in text, music, and leadership practices. Second, marginalized peoples sing the hymns of empire and transform them through their agency in the very act of their singing. Sometimes hymns are transformed in translation, other times they are transformed in the way they are sung as heartfelt, passionate expressions of resistance. For instance, and theologically speaking, Canadian Anglican Indigenous Bishop Mark MacDonald says that underneath what we see and hear in Indigenous hymn singing is a dynamic of life which is unveiled and released in singing. It enables a different cosmovision, including an eschatology which is defiant, because it is present in the here and now through singing. Hymns clothed in the garments of European hymnody are thus inverted, flipped by the people who sing them. subverting theologies of empire and colonialism and becoming instruments of resistance and rebuke, as well as sources of forbearance, strength, and hope. Latin American decolonial scholars name this kind of dynamic epistemic disobedience as expressions of other ways of knowing, thinking, and being that point beyond the modern colonial, patriarchal, capitalist world system. Third, songs from the global South and marginalized communities in the global North rise up and are voiced in fragile spaces that have already been opened up by those from the underside in worship spaces. Let me share a brief example with you and then conclude by suggesting some implications of these dynamics in the present pandemic context. I always thought that what a friend we have in Jesus was a clear-cut example of coloniality. Emphasizing a theology of substitutionary atonement, it essentializes the singing subject as a depraved, sinful being dependent on the superior salvific nature of the Christian God. With lines like weak and heavy laden, cumbered with a load of care, it voices, I thought, a pietistic reduction of human nature to a kind of pathetic, iniquitous being. In the spring of 1987, the mother of my exiled Sotho South African friend died at her home in Soweto, South Africa. At a makeshift memorial service at my parents' house, the exiled South African community gathered to grieve with Nadeau. When they chose to sing this hymn, the pietistic reading of the text was disrupted as these singers flipped the song, and it became instead a song of defiance, a locus of contestation. The singers changed the meaning of the song through the very act of singing. What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. It affirmed the real life griefs, pain, and trial of dehumanizing circumstances, the hardship of life under the brutal rule of the apartheid regime. Singing this song promised hope, lifted up the fundamental humanness of the singers, and became an encouragement to continue in the struggle for those whose lives had been dedicated to overthrowing the racist government. When we sang with Nadeau, we all bore witness to his grief and to his exile. As comrades and allies, we embodied a theology of solidarity in the act of our singing. Along similar lines, Susan Beaver, Kanakeha, or Mohawk United Church minister, affirms the importance of this hymn for many Indigenous peoples. She says it is a cry for help for the people and helps those who suffer, struggle with grief, need help, especially spiritual help, or face other challenges like the temptations of addiction, among other things. The thing is, Beaver says, in the history of the church as our people see it, the visitors came and told us how we worship is wrong. So we picked up their Bible and churches and hymns and quite loved them or understood them as the norm. Now the people say we worship the way they told us to worship, and now they're coming and telling us our worship is wrong again. In these contexts of struggle, this traditional hymn, which one might be inclined to reject because of its old-fashioned theology, can actually embody a resistance to the very constructs of coloniality when it is reconfigured by the communities that sing it. Now, in this pandemic moment, many communities are trying new things in their online worship. They have been liberated from the traditional structures of worship and are rethinking their rites, hymns, prayers, and ways of worship, looking for renewal and even ways to deepen decolonizing impetuses and commitments. On the other hand, some communities have abandoned prior commitments to decolonize and are returning to traditional rites and hymns, longing for and thus re-entrenching some distance long past Eurocentric idea of, quote, normal. In such settings, patterns of top-down privileged leadership are asserted and exclusion is intensified as white male voices assert power over Zoom. So there's a choice. And my hunch is that this example of worship is likely applicable in other contexts. We can seize this moment to reconfigure what we do in worship and scholarship and teaching along decolonial lines, or we can allow patterns of coloniality to be re-entrenched, returning to this so-called normal, and in so doing exacerbate conditions of inequality, marginalization, racism, etc. In other words, will we address the enduring nature of empire and the ongoing and intensifying impacts of coloniality or not? Will we return to normal, or will we recognize that the very idea of normal needs to be urgently decolonized and flip it? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Becca, for this presentation. So just as you could hear, the issue was addressed in very different, in a variety of perspectives of the way to address it. Now I will just take some questions. Just when you're ready to ask a question or make a comment, just signal it in the chat. And I was told that we have till 2:15 to have a conversation about this. If there's no comment, I have a comment. I have a question on my side for, I don't know, for all of you, of some people's. I was listening to you, and I was thinking about the news that we get on yesterday about the residential school in British Columbia, where 215 bodies of children, of Indigenous children, were found. When you learned about it, when you read about it, and you heard about it, how did it sound with what you just have presented right now? And after that, I think, okay. And after that, Michael Gillingham will have a question.
Jean-François, that's a really troubling question that we need to go into, and I'm very glad you asked that. I was talking with my mom this morning and telling her about my presentation in light of that news, and one of the things we were talking about was about how present the historic legacy of colonization is in not only Canadian societies broadly, but my research focuses on the Christian churches. And one of the things that I've been looking at that I didn't present today is how I focus on children, child health and children's well-being in all kinds of ways, about how I think that Sunday schools are actually a replication site for colonial messaging still. And it was just one more reminder of how far there is to go before, not just before we can, a reconciliation can be achieved, but before we're actually having an honest look at the harms that were done historically and that we're continuing to perpetuate and cover up and participate in today. And one of the things that I'm trying to write now is a reflection on how we're still doing this in different packaging. So thanks for asking that.
Thank you. I have some questions. The first by Michael Gillingham. So.
First of all, thanks for all of these presentations. So rich and so appreciated. Valerie, I work with young people in a Christian context in a congregation, and one of the things I've been thinking about, particularly our families that want to homeschool, sort of the rights of kids to decide about their education and where parents want to impose. But I'm also, the pandemic raises new questions for me, and I just wondered about your thoughts about the rights of children to choose their own path forward with regards to vaccines. If you see that raises some interesting questions about children's rights in a certain sense, kind of a violence against children. But interested in any thoughts you might have about that, if you're willing.
Michael, that's such a good question. I thought thought you were going to take me to homeschooling and schooling, and I was going to tell you about the Convention of the Rights of the Child and Article 12. You know, we could have a really good discussion about children's rights to have a say in the choices that are made about them. And then you switched to vaccines. And I also teach in public health. And I'm a firm believer of the collective good of vaccines. And so it's not the purpose of this panel, but I would be very hesitant to talk about vaccines at this point as being really a reasonable individual choice without some really good reasons around that because of the collective good. And we see countries who are much more typically collectivist societies doing much better in the pandemic outcomes because they're doing things like mask wearing, receiving vaccines, than the countries that are being individualistic about it. It's me, I can make my own choice, but our choices really do impact others. So I would really want to inform children, but also as part of that I wouldn't enforce a vaccine on anyone. And there are good reasons, good medical and cultural reasons not to get a vaccine, but I'm very pro-vaccine and work with a lot of epidemiologists and immunologists who would be horrified if that became, at this point, an individual choice in this particular situation where many people are at risks because of individualistic attitudes and my rights versus collective rights. So this is such a good question, and I would love to actually have a talk about what you're doing. I worked with young people in that kind of context for a long time.
Thank you. Patricia Dold has a question.
I don't think so, actually. I think I was just making the odd comment.
Okay. If so, David.
David Seljak has a question.
Yes. David.
Great session. Thank you very much. I loved the early discussion of the theme of the session, which is decolonizing urgency. Sorry. I wonder if the panelists can speak to the sense of urgency that universities have adopted after the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which included the indigenization of universities themselves. I was involved in a process at the University of Waterloo, and there is this kind of urgency about addressing indigenization, but the comments made about decolonizing urgency really spoke to me. So I wonder if people might reflect on that.
I'll start with that one. I was involved initially with some work on indigenizing at Concordia. That was a couple of years ago. And I've watched my own mind and work switch to decolonizing. And I've also kind of conversant with a lot of Indigenous people who think it's not possible to indigenize the academy. I think the task is to decolonize the academy. I was listening to the Métis lawyer, Amy Kraft, and she says, Indigenous knowledge and teachings are a dog, universities a cat. Like, how can you cat a dog or dog a cat? But she said, it's just not possible. And there's a lot of people who feel that way now. So if you shift to decolonization, then at least it's something that's a slightly, I don't know what you want to say, more manageable, but it's more, because the indigenizing the academy is very performative. We'll have elders at everything. We're going to have our statement, land. But the structures are so fundamentally Eurocentric that it's a huge battle. And I just, so anyways, those are my thoughts that I think we should shift the focus. And can I just answer about Kamloops Residential School? If that isn't the most profound example of disposability of bodies, and Indigenous people not being human. And if I'm an Indigenous person now hearing that, how am I going to separate that from now? Because it just reinforces that Indigenous peoples are seen as property and bodies. So I think it's had a huge impact because it's brought the past right back to the present. Thank you.
I would just, before, because Michel had something to say too, when I asked my question, I was thinking about what you said, Denise, about the Western concept of time and the Western way to live time and the colonial way. We are on timeline. We want to move forward. And now you have, and then you have this sort of trauma that happens another time when we find so horrific reality of what you just said. So what could mean decolonizing urgency in this time? We have to take time to just to honor what happened and to take the measure of that. Michel wanted to say something.
I'm not sure if Becca's hand was before me, I think.
Okay, Becca.
I go after Becca.
Okay. I didn't see Becca. Becca, okay, it's your turn.
Just, I also wanted to make a brief comment about the news from Kamloops to say that something that struck me, spoken by a survivor from that school, was that there were no funerals. So there is, I think, a moment now for that needs to be guided by survivors and the families of those who died to ritualize and to dignify the lives that were lost. And so there's a sort of role for ritual liturgical practice there. So I don't know what that looks like, but there's, that just really struck me as something that leaped out at me. And I briefly wanted to also address David's question, but actually I forget what I was going to say, so I'm going to pass it over to Michel and maybe come back to that. I'll just collect my thoughts.
Okay, Becca. Michel?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there is a sense of urgency at the universities for decolonizing, and this, I'm new at St. Paul. That's my only first year, but I came in the middle of a strategic plan for the next 5 years. We're decolonizing the university, and what in French we use the term autochtonisation, and more indigenizing. And also there are some, I think there are some very serious initiative, and the administration and many professors care deeply about this. We all feel the pressure of the moment, in a sense of, like, we realize how colonial our systems are of thinking, of teaching, of pedagogy, curriculum, and mostly in theology. I mean, it's like at the heart of this, where the Eurocentric approach to theological education is still powerful, and where, I mean, many other dimensions in theology, because of the church's involvement all along and the little that has been done since the new awareness. It's almost a scandal, given the ethical and historic responsibility to like think in some really new ways. And since we are affiliated with the University of Ottawa, and also the University of Ottawa issued, published a major 5-year action plan for indigenizing. And so what does that mean? I think we're still learning. Like at St. Paul, there is an Indigenous center built at the heart of the university, with having Indigenous knowledge keepers and residents available to students, because there is a small percentage of students that's Indigenous and need to attend to that as creating a space of dialogue. But it's also a center that's promoting a whole new ethos of ways of relating and community building and attention that affects all aspects of the university. In theology, we are doing like a major course in 10 days, one intensive week on church and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, where we have about 20 speakers half of whom are indigenous leaders in the church and from multiple denominations. So, and church leaders, but all are critical voices that are trying to, the title of the course is Church and Reconciliation with Indigenous Peoples, framing the ecclesial and theological questions. We just started a center at the Faculty of Theology for Church and Reconciliation with Indigenous Peoples, where the course now is sort of launching this initiative. We need to identify more the questions, and we have an intention in investing. So it's a huge undertaking. It's un grand chantier. We're not exactly sure. We're making the road as we walk, but we're accompanied by indigenous elders that have establishing good relations. We make mistakes. We move one step forward, one step backward. Yet it's unclear where we're going, but I think we're going somewhere.
Thank you, Michel. Becca?
Yeah, thanks. I find Michel's words so hopeful, and I think that what he's describing is definitely something that's happening in many spaces. But I also want to kind of issue a caution, because I think that, as Denise said, it can stay with being performative. And I think there's increasingly language and scholarship about decolonizing, which is somewhat empty. And it's kind of the latest trendy language to be used. And it doesn't necessarily connect with action or changes in how we teach or how we design curriculum or who gets hired. I want to be hopeful, so I want to stay with that. But I also think that there's a big caution, and that kind of connects with what I was talking about at the end of my presentation, this sort of choice that we have, and we can say the right thing, but are we actually doing the right thing? And I think that that's just something that we all need to bear in mind when we talk about decolonizing. How is it connected to all aspects of our scholarship, our teaching, and our lives? Like, are we actually, what does it mean? And there's a growing chorus of people who are I saw that there's a panel here about decolonizing, which I think is which is urgent, because so that we don't co-opt that language and let ourselves off the hook of actually doing the harder work that will take a long time and that is urgent but can't be accomplished overnight.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Becca. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, I think so. No, I think it's a comment. It's a comment. Yes.
I think Cheryl had a question in the chat.
Cheryl, yes. Okay. There was a comment. Yes. Oh, yes, that's a question. Yes. You're okay.
Yeah. It's like, how do we work to get the Sunday school teachers educated? I mean, this is one of the big problems with anything that we're doing with reassessing theology, is you can get the church to do something, you can get the ministers to do something, but the ones who are actually teaching the children are usually volunteers. They're busy, they've got full-time jobs, and they aren't getting trained beyond how to teach kids and things like that. They really aren't getting the insights. It's not filtering down. And that's the big challenge, I think. And then when you throw in homeschooling and everything else, it just makes it worse. But how do we get the churches? So like, for instance, I have 3 churches. Right now with the pandemic, their number one concern is, how do we pay the bills? You know, how do we minister to the ones who can't come to church? How do we reach them? And we need a new roof. So it's a big bill that's coming up, but I don't think we can postpone it anymore. And so anything with Indigenous, cross-cultural, it's like, I can preach it, but their priorities are so different. How do we get it? And that's one of the big things I'm interested in.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Maybe I could speak to that quickly, Cheryl. Something I've certainly, my doctoral work was in the area of children in the church. And I think starting at the church level is not really going to get at the crux of the problem, because children are incredibly marginalized at the seminary level and in terms of different theologies. I have colleagues like Marcia Bungie, who has done phenomenal work thinking about a child theological approaches. The child theologies movement is wonderful, but very unknown. You know, children have been marginalized. They're the most photographed and least listened to members of churches. And so starting at seminary levels, taking children more seriously, not as human beings in waiting, but as full human beings. We need to change the whole way that we think about children, for starters. But it's, I think also, what we do in the Sunday schools is inconsequential if we're not going to disrupt messages of, I'll give you an example. I'm working on white dominance in children's ministries right now, and kind of the implicit, and this is just one of many examples I could give you. I'm glad to give you some writing I've been doing on this if you're interested, but looking at the intersections of things like race and SES and culture in the way we teach our children, how we teach our children about land, and that Moses story we teach them, or the Joshua going into the promised land is the doctrine of discovery, you know, just told all over again, and we all celebrate it. So we're replicating these colonial messages, and the sense of white supremacy is so implicit. If you ever open a children's Bible, you're going to see white Jesus, white Mary. And so it's not actually talked about. Of course, we know Jesus isn't white, but the message is there that the model of the Christian faith is white. And so there's all kinds of implicit messages that are embedded in our ministry to children that are just buying into the same colonial messages that are so profoundly oppressive and directly related to Jean-François' first question about the news story about the children who were found in such an undignified way, just how shameful that is for the churches. That was shameful in itself, but the fact that we're not willing to disrupt those messages makes it even worse. So that's a start, maybe.
Thank you, Valerie. Are there any other questions or comment?
I don't know, do we have time for another comment on that same question?
Yes,
yes, we have.
Okay. I also teach Christian education at St. Andrews, and what I would say.
Whoops, froze.
We have lost the connection with Becca.
Give it a few seconds.
You warned us this might happen.
Yeah.
Oh, I think we've lost Becca. It was just interesting, but anyway, so if so, there could be another question. Oh, I just realized I accidentally shared my screen. Oh, okay. These are the kind of things that can happen.
We saw
no
your
problem.
Bank statement. We're yes. Funneling your funds now to ours.
So, je vais parler français pour conclure. Bien, je trouve que nous avons eu, et ça a été mentionné par plusieurs d'entre vous et dans le chat aussi, ça a été des présentations extrêmement riches et puis qui ont donné lieu à des questions intéressantes aussi. Je ne parle pas de la mienne, mais je parle des autres. Et je remercie beaucoup les présentateurs. D'abord, on vous remercie de nous avoir fait cette place au congrès. Mais je remercie beaucoup les présentateurs qui ont travaillé de façon très disciplinée aussi. On parlait du concept occidental de temps, mais nous y sommes tenus, n'est-ce pas? Et cela a permis d'avoir des échanges. Alors, merci beaucoup pour votre attention. Je pense que nous pouvons donc passer à la suite du programme.
Oui, merci Jean-François. Merci à tous et à tous pour les très belles présentations. Oui, très intéressantes, très riches. Yeah, so we're on break time now. We're gonna resume at 2:30 for our next and last panel for today, titled "Examining Why and How We Teach Religious Competency: Real-World Applications" with Michel Folk, Brenda Anderson, Kamer Hamid, Rebecca King, and Alicia Cummins. So, you know, I'm going to keep the room open. You hang out as long as you like. If you need a break, go ahead and take one, and then hope to see many of you back, or all of you back here at 2:30. So just same room, same Zoom room. And yeah, so it's good. Thank you once again. And yeah, I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Today.
Bye-bye.
Great session. Yeah.